Atlanta's sweltering summer shrouded the upscale Buckhead neighborhood in a sweltering shroud. The air conditioners were running at full blast, trying to keep the luxurious mansions lining the quiet streets cool. Among these houses stood out a two-story colonial-style building owned by the Jackson family. Chanel Jackson, the 23-year-old wife of successful businessman Darryl, stood at the panoramic window, absent-mindedly watching the gardener mowing the perfect lawn. Her slender figure, clad in a light silk dress, seemed the epitome of grace and elegance. However, in the dark eyes of the young woman read inexorable longing. 3 years ago, Chanel married Darryl Jackson, the 35-year-old owner of a chain of elite restaurants. She had been dazzled by his success, charisma, and the promise of a life of luxury. Now, looking at her reflection in the mirrored window, Chanel barely recognized herself. Where was that cheerful girl who dreamed of a career as an artist? Flawless makeup and designer clothes could not hide the emptiness in her eyes. Darryl was a good husband, caring, generous, successful. He provided Chanel with a life that many could only dream of. But every day she felt more and more acutely that she was suffocating in a golden cage. Her world narrowed to social gatherings, charity dinners, and endless trips to boutiques. The passion that had once flared between them had long since faded, replaced by routine and cold politeness. Chanel sighed and turned away from the window. She needed to get ready for another charity event where Darryl planned to discuss the expansion of his business with potential investors. She mechanically opened the dressing room, selecting an outfit that would emphasize her beauty and status but not overshadow the other guests, an unspoken rule in their circle. As Chanel prepared for the evening, her thoughts involuntarily returned to the recent incident. 3 days ago, during her morning jog, she had literally bumped into her new neighbor, an elderly man who had recently moved into the house across the street. Wilford Baker, a 71-year-old widower, was unexpectedly pleasant to talk to. His kind eyes shone with wisdom and serenity, and his deep voice with a slight hoarseness awakened in Chanel long-forgotten feelings. They got to talking, and Chanel was surprised to find that for the first time in a long time, she was truly interested in talking to someone. Wilford turned out to be a former professor of literature, a connoisseur of art, and an avid traveler. His stories about distant countries and amazing adventures mesmerized the young woman, awakening in her a long-forgotten thirst for life. Since that day, Chanel began to go jogging more often, hoping to accidentally meet Wilford. They exchanged a few phrases, discussed books, art, shared thoughts about life. These brief encounters were a breath of fresh air for Chanel in the stuffy atmosphere of her golden cage. The evening of the charity event went on as usual. Strained smiles, empty conversations, and displays of wealth and status. Chanel played the role of the perfect wife, keeping the conversations flowing and charming the guests. Darryl, as always, was the center of attention, discussing his ambitious plans to expand his business. Back at home, Chanel felt devastated. She took off her designer dress and jewelry, washed off her makeup, and stood under the hot jets of the shower for a long time, trying to wash away the falseness of the previous evening. Wrapping herself in a soft robe, she stepped out onto the balcony of her bedroom, breathing in the night air. Her gaze slid involuntarily to the house across the street. A dim light burned in the window of Wilford's study. Chanel imagined the elderly man sitting in a cozy armchair, immersed in reading some rare book. This picture made her smile, the first genuine smile she'd had all day. The next morning, Chanel woke up earlier than usual. Darryl had already left for an important meeting, leaving a note that he would return late in the evening. The young woman was relieved to have the whole day to herself. She put on a tracksuit and went out for a jog, secretly hoping to meet Wilford. Luck smiled on her. The elderly neighbor was just leaving the house to pick up the morning paper. Seeing Chanel, he waved at her in a friendly manner. She stepped closer, feeling her heart begin to beat faster. Wilford looked unusually alert for his age. His gray hair was neatly combed and a lively interest shone in his brown eyes. He offered Chanel a cup of morning coffee, and she, to her surprise, accepted without hesitation. Wilford's house was the opposite of the luxurious Jackson mansion. It was cozy and warm. Bookshelves lined the walls, and the scent of old folios and freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air. Chanel felt as if she had entered another world, a world she had once dreamed of. They talked about art, and Wilford showed Chanel some rare painting albums. His fingers, despite his age, were surprisingly dexterous as he flipped through the fragile pages. Chanel caught every word he said, feeling a long-forgotten passion for creativity awaken in her. Time flew by unnoticed. When Chanel finally glanced at her watch, she realized with horror that she had spent several hours at Wilford's house. Apologizing, she hurriedly left her hospitable host, feeling a mixture of guilt and strange excitement. Back home, Chanel couldn't stop thinking about Wilford. His wisdom, kindness, and consideration had awakened feelings in her that she thought were long dead. She tried to distract herself by doing housework, but her thoughts kept returning to her elderly neighbor. Daryl returned in the evening, tired but pleased with the results of the meeting. He absent-mindedly pecked his wife on the cheek and went straight to studying the documents. Chanel looked at her husband, trying to feel something like love or affection, but felt only emptiness and alienation. At night, lying awake next to Daryl, sleeping peacefully, Chanel thought about her life. She remembered how she had once dreamed of becoming an artist, how her eyes burned at the sight of new colors and canvases. Now her hands, which once created beautiful paintings, were decorated only with expensive rings and bracelets. In the morning, Chanel made a decision. She pulled out her old paints and easel from the far corner of the pantry. Her hands trembled with excitement as she set the canvas on the terrace. Her first strokes were tentative, but gradually, she remembered forgotten skills. Immersed in her creativity, Chanel didn't notice how time flew by. She only woke up when she heard the sound of a car pulling up. Daryl had returned. The young woman hastily hid her easel and paints, feeling as if she had been caught doing something shameful. That evening, lying in bed, Chanel pondered her feelings. She realized that it was not physical attraction that drew her to Wilford, but a longing for the spiritual intimacy she had lacked in her marriage to Daryl. But guilt and fear of the unknown kept her from taking decisive steps. So began a new stage in the life of Chanel Jackson, the stage of secret meetings with Wilford Baker, filled with conversations about art and literature, and hidden from all the activities of painting. She didn't know where this path would lead her, but for the first time in a long time, she felt truly alive. Summer was winding down in Atlanta, filling the air with suffocating heat and the scent of magnolias in bloom. For Chanel Jackson, these days were a time of awakening long-forgotten feelings and emotions. Her dark skin, usually impeccably groomed, now often glistened with sweat after long hours spent at her easel on the terrace of Wilford Baker's house. Wilford, despite his advanced age, radiated an energy and vitality that magnetically attracted Chanel. His wrinkled, ebony-colored face glowed with wisdom and kindness, and his eyes, surrounded by a network of small wrinkles, always looked at the young woman with genuine interest and warmth. Their meetings became more frequent and longer. Chanel learned to masterfully lie to her husband, explaining her absence with yoga classes or meetings with friends. Daryl, immersed in his business, seemed not to notice the changes in his wife's behavior. Once, during another visit to Wilford, Chanel dared to show him her new works. She stood nervously rubbing the edge of her blouse while the older man scrutinized her paintings. "You have real talent, Chanel," Wilford finally said, and his deep voice made the young woman's heart beat faster. "Your work is full of life and passion. Why haven't you taken up painting before?" Chanel lowered her eyes, feeling the blood rush to her cheeks. "Daryl, my husband, he thinks it's a waste of time. Says I need to focus on more important things. Charities, social events." Wilford shook his head, and in his gaze, Chanel saw a mixture of sympathy and slight condemnation. "Art is not a waste of time, my dear. It's a way to express your soul, to share your vision of beauty with the world." His words touched Chanel deeply. For the first time in a long time, she felt that someone truly understood her, valued her not for her beauty or status, but for her inner world. From that day on, their relationship became even closer. Wilford shared with Chanel his knowledge of art, told her about the great artists of the past, many of whom were also African American. He showed her rare books and sketchbooks and taught her new painting techniques. Chanel absorbed this knowledge greedily, feeling her talent blossom under Wilford's sensitive guidance. She began to experiment with color and form, creating increasingly bold and expressive works. However, along with the creative upsurge grew a sense of guilt. Chanel realized that her relationship with Wilford had long since gone beyond a casual friendship. Although there was no physical intimacy between them, the emotional bond grew stronger every day. On nights lying next to Daryl, Chanel often couldn't sleep, tormented by conflicting feelings. She compared her young, successful husband to her elderly neighbor, and this comparison was increasingly not in Daryl's favor. Where Daryl saw only numbers and transactions, Wilford saw beauty and depth. Where Daryl demanded conformity to status, Wilford encouraged freedom of expression. The age difference between Chanel and Wilford, which at first had seemed an insurmountable chasm, now seemed to her an insignificant detail. What did years mean compared to a soulmate? Reality, however, was in no hurry to recede. Chanel felt more and more acutely the bifurcation of her life. By day she was Chanel Baker, a passionate artist, interesting conversationalist, alive and real. In the evening, she again turned into Chanel Jackson, the ideal wife of a successful businessman, a beautiful doll without her own desires and aspirations. The tension in her relationship with Daryl was growing. Chanel began to notice the disgruntled looks of her husband when she refused to accompany him to another business event. Daryl increasingly asked questions about where she spent her days, who she was seeing. One evening when Chanel returned home after a particularly inspiring day with Wilford, Daryl met her in the living room. His dark face was unaccustomedly serious. "Where have you been, Chanel?" he asked, and there was a note of suspicion in his voice. "I told you, at a friend's house," Chanel replied, trying to keep her voice sounding calm and confident. Daryl rose from his chair and approached her. His tall figure loomed over Chanel, making her feel small and defenseless. "That's odd," he stretched out. "I called Lottie and she said she hadn't seen you in weeks." Chanel felt the ground go from under her feet. She'd forgotten that she'd given Daryl the name of the friend she'd supposedly been spending time with. I wasn't at Lottie's," she mumbled, feverishly coming up with an excuse. "I was out with another friend. You don't know her." Daryl looked at his wife intently, and Chanel thought he saw right through her with all her secrets and lies. "You've changed, Chanel," he finally said. "I don't recognize you lately. What's going on?" Chanel felt a lump come up to her throat. She wanted to tell the truth, to share her feelings, her dreams, but the fear of losing everything she had paralyzed her. "Nothing's going on, Daryl," she replied, averting her gaze. I'm just tired a little. I need some time to myself." Daryl stared at her for a long moment, as if trying to solve a riddle. Then he sighed heavily and turned away. "All right, Chanel, if you say so." This conversation left a heavy residue in Chanel's soul. She realized that she couldn't live a double life for long, that sooner or later she would have to make a choice. But the thought of giving up Wilford, the art, the part of herself she had just begun to discover, was unbearable. The next day, Chanel came to Wilford's house, upset and depressed. The elderly man noticed her condition at once. "What's wrong, dear?" he asked, sitting Chanel down in her favorite chair and offering her a cup of hot tea. Chanel couldn't stand it and cried, pouring out all her fears and doubts to Wilford. She spoke of her guilt over Daryl, her fear of losing her familiar life, her uncertainty about the future. Wilford listened to her in silence, only nodding his head occasionally. When Chanel finally fell silent, wiping away her tears, he took her hand. "Chanel," he said softly, "you can't live someone else's life forever. You're a talented, bright woman, and you deserve to be happy, but it's up to you to make the decision." His words made Chanel think she remembered how she had once dreamed of becoming an artist, how she had presented her paintings in galleries, how she wanted to change the world with her art. Where had all those dreams gone? Was she ready to give them up for a comfortable but empty life? At that moment, Chanel realized that her feelings for Wilford were not just an infatuation or an attempt to escape reality. It was something deep and real, something that made her heart beat faster and her soul sing with happiness. The following weeks passed like a blur for Chanel. She spent more and more time with Wilford, immersing herself in the world of art and literature. Her paintings became increasingly bold and expressive, reflecting the storm of emotions raging in her soul. Daryl seemed to accept his wife's detachment, immersed in his work. He was less and less at home, and more often stayed late at the office. Chanel felt that their marriage was cracking at the seams, but did not find the strength to change anything. One evening when Chanel returned from Wilford's, she found Daryl in her studio. He was standing in front of her latest painting, a bright, expressive canvas depicting two people merging into one. "So this is what you do," Daryl said quietly without turning around. Chanel could hear the pain and frustration in his voice. "Daryl, she began, but her husband interrupted her. "Don't, Chanel. I understand everything. You found yourself, and I'm happy for you. I really am." He turned toward her, and Chanel saw tears in his eyes. "I'm just sorry I couldn't give you what you were looking for." That moment was a turning point in Chanel's life. She realized she couldn't lie anymore. Not to Daryl, not to herself. It was time to make a choice, no matter how difficult. Her feet led her to Wilford's house on their own. It was late, but the light in his study was still on. Chanel knocked, feeling her heart pounding. Wilford opened the door, his face expressing surprise and concern. "Chanel? What's wrong?" She took a step inside, shaking with her whole body. "Daryl, he recognized. He saw my paintings." Wilford hugged her gently, trying to calm her. "Shh, shh, shh. It's going to be okay." Chanel raised her eyes, meeting Wilford's gaze. In that moment, all barriers crumbled. She reached for him, and their lips met in a passionate kiss. Despite the age difference, Wilford proved to be a gentle and passionate lover. His touch, confident and experienced, made Chanel tremble with desire. She gave herself to him with all the passion she had held back for so long. Their dark bodies melded into one, the contrast of Chanel's young, supple skin and Wilford's wrinkled but still strong skin creating a marvelous harmony. Chanel felt every cell of her body come alive under Wilford's caresses. Later, lying in each other's arms, they were silent, realizing that their lives would never be the same again. Chanel knew she would have to face the consequences of her actions, but in that moment, she felt only peace and confidence in her choices. Morning found them still together. Chanel woke first, watching the first rays of sunlight play on Wilford's dark skin. She gently ran her finger over his wrinkled face, feeling deeply grateful that he had helped her find herself. Wilford opened his eyes and smiled at her. "Good morning, my muse," he whispered. Chanel smiled back, but her eyes were serious. "We need to talk about the future," she said. "I can't go back to my old life." Wilford nodded, realizing the gravity of the situation. "Whatever you decide, I'll support you," he said, squeezing her hand. Chanel took a deep breath, feeling the determination growing in her. She knew there were difficult conversations and tough decisions ahead of her. But for the first time in a long time, she felt truly alive and ready to face the future, whatever it might be. The morning was unusually sweltering, even for hot Atlanta. Wilford Baker woke up early, as usual, despite the sleepless night. His thoughts were preoccupied with Chanel and the events of the previous evening. He realized that their relationship had reached a point of no return, and now they had to face the consequences of their actions. Wilford rose slowly from the bed, feeling his joints aching. Age was making itself known more and more often, especially in the mornings. He went to the window and pulled back the curtains, letting the bright sunlight into the room. His gaze slid involuntarily to the Jackson house across the street. All was quiet there, and Wilford wondered if Chanel had gone home or stayed with a friend, as she'd told him when she'd left at dawn. The day promised to be a busy one. Wilford planned to finish work on his new book, a collection of essays on 20th century African American art. The subject was particularly close to his heart, and working on the book was a way for him to pass on his knowledge and experience to the younger generation. Wilford went down to the kitchen and made himself a light breakfast, avocado toast and a cup of strong coffee. He had always maintained a healthy diet, which was probably the secret to his longevity and vigor. As he ate his breakfast, he glanced at the morning paper. but the news seemed distant and unimportant compared to the storm of emotions that raged in his soul. After breakfast, Wilford settled himself in his study. An antique desk littered with books and manuscripts, a computer on which he typed his work, and walls hung with paintings and photographs all created an atmosphere of creativity and inspiration. Wilford immersed himself in his work, trying not to think about Chanel and how his life had changed in recent weeks. Time flew by. Wilford was so engrossed in writing another chapter that he missed lunch. Only when the sun began to sink did he look up from his computer and was surprised to find that it was already evening. Feeling slightly dizzy from sitting for so long, Wilford decided to go for a walk. Fresh air always helped him clear his thoughts and come up with new ideas. He put on a light shirt and pants, took his cane, not so much out of necessity as out of habit, and left the house. The streets of the suburbs were quiet. Neighbors hid in their homes, fleeing the evening heat. Wilford walked slowly along the sidewalk, enjoying the scent of blooming magnolias and the sounds of nature, which gradually drowned out the noise of the city. His thoughts returned to Chanel again. Wilford realized that their relationship had been a mistake from the beginning. The age difference, her marriage, all of it had created insurmountable obstacles. But he couldn't deny the strength of the feelings he had for the young woman. Her passion for art, her desire to break free from the golden cage in which she had imprisoned herself, all these things resonated with him. Immersed in his thoughts, Wilford didn't notice when he reached a small park on the outskirts of the neighborhood. He sat down on a bench, watching the last rays of the sun color the sky in bright orange and purple tones. At that moment, he felt a strange peacefulness, as if all worries and doubts had receded into the background. When it got dark, Wilford decided to go home. He walked slowly, enjoying the coolness of the evening. As he passed the Jackson house, he noticed lights in the windows and the silhouettes of two people. It looked like Chanel and Daryl were arguing about something. Wilford quickened his pace, feeling a pang of guilt for causing a rift in their family. Back at home, Wilford felt strangely tired. He decided to skip dinner and go straight to bed. As he climbed the stairs, he suddenly felt a sharp pain in his chest. The pain was so intense that he almost fell over. Wilford grabbed the railing, trying to catch his breath. When the pain subsided a little, he struggled to get to the bedroom and lay on the bed without undressing. Wilford knew he should call an ambulance, but the phone had been left downstairs, and he didn't have the strength to go downstairs. He lay staring at the ceiling and thought about his life, about the books he'd written, the students he'd taught, the paintings he'd admired, and about Chanel, the last bright splash in his long life. Gradually, the pain began to recede, replaced by a strange numbness. Wilford felt his consciousness fogging up. His last thought was the hope that Chanel would find the strength to follow her dream, no matter what happened. The next morning was unusually quiet. Wilford's neighbors, accustomed to seeing him early in the morning in the garden or out jogging, were surprised to note that the old man had not appeared. The curtains on the windows of his house remained closed, and the newspaper remained in the mailbox. By noon, the neighbors' concern had grown to alarm. Mrs. Johnson, an elderly lady who lived next door, decided to see if everything was all right. She went to the door of the Wilford house and rang the bell. There was no answer. She knocked. Silence again. Alarmed, Mrs. Johnson called Mr. Thompson, another neighbor, for help. Together they walked around the house looking in the windows. When they reached the second-floor bedroom window, they saw Wilford's motionless body on the bed. Mr. Thompson immediately called the police and an ambulance. Within minutes, the quiet street was ringed with sirens. Neighbors began coming out of their homes, attracted by the unusual noise. Among them was Chanel, who watched in horror as paramedics entered Wilford's home. Police arrived almost simultaneously with the ambulance. Detective Patrick Green, a tall, dark-skinned man in his 40s, stepped out of an unremarkable gray car and immediately took control of the situation. He quickly assessed the situation and began giving orders to his subordinates. While the paramedics went up to the bedroom, Detective Green interviewed the neighbors. His attention was drawn to a young woman standing a little apart from the others. Her face was pale, and her eyes showed genuine horror. Green approached Chanel and introduced himself. Her reaction to his neighbor's death struck him as unusual, too emotional for a mere acquaintance. He made a mental note to talk to her in more detail later. The medics came down with grim faces. Wilford Baker was dead, and from all appearances he had died during the night. At first glance, the death seemed natural. A heart attack in an elderly man was not unusual. Detective Green, however, was in no hurry to jump to conclusions. He went up to the bedroom to personally inspect the scene. Wilford's body was lying on the bed, dressed in daytime clothes. This struck Green as odd. Usually people changed their clothes before going to bed. On the bedside table was a glass of water and an open book. It looked as if Wilford had just laid down to rest and hadn't woken up. Green looked around the room carefully. There was nothing to indicate a struggle or the presence of intruders. However, his attention was drawn to a slightly ajar closet door. Looking inside, the detective found several drawers pulled halfway out, as if someone was hurriedly searching for something. Going downstairs, Green turned his attention to Wilford's office. The books and papers on the desk were in slight disarray, which, according to his neighbors, was uncharacteristic of the neat professor. A word processing document was open on the computer. It looked like Wilford had been working on a book into the evening. Detective Green instructed his team to do a thorough search of the house and the surrounding area. He himself returned to the street to continue interviewing the neighbors. He was particularly interested in the events of the previous evening. Had anyone seen or heard anything unusual? Most of the neighbors could report nothing of interest. Mrs. Johnson, however, remembered seeing Wilford returning from a walk late in the afternoon. She noticed that he looked tired and was walking slower than usual. Mr. Thompson added that about midnight he heard some noise like the sound of a door slamming shut. He didn't pay much attention to it, thinking he was imagining it. Chanel had been standing off to the side the whole time with her arms wrapped around herself, as if trying to protect herself from what was happening. When Detective Green approached her, she flinched as if waking from a deep sleep. Green gently asked her to tell him what she knew about Wilford Baker. Chanel, stammering and muddling her words, told her that they were just neighbors, occasionally chatting, discussing art. Her voice trembled and her eyes were full of tears. The detective listened intently, noting the inconsistencies in her story. He sensed that the young woman was hiding something, but decided not to press her now. He would have time for a more detailed conversation later. As Wilford's body was carried out of the house, Chanel couldn't stand it and burst into tears. Her husband, Daryl, who had been standing nearby the whole time, put his arm around her, trying to comfort her. Green noticed how tense Daryl's face became as he looked at his neighbor's body. His gaze read something akin to relief. Detective Green realized that what at first seemed like a simple case of natural death could be much more complicated. He sensed that behind the facade of this quiet suburb lurked secrets and passions that could have led to tragedy. While the forensics team continued to work on the house, Green went to his office. He was to investigate Wilford Baker's past, his connections and relationships with his neighbors. He was certain that the key to unraveling this story lay in the last weeks of the elderly professor's life. The mysterious circumstances of Wilford Baker's death, the strange behavior of some of his neighbors, and an unexplained sense of unease kept Detective Green on his toes. He knew he had a complex investigation ahead of him that could uncover the dark secrets of this seemingly perfect suburb. Detective Patrick Green sat at his desk, littered with folders and documents. It had been a week since Wilford Baker's death, and the investigation was gaining momentum. Green methodically reviewed the testimony of neighbors, forensic reports, and autopsy results, trying to piece together the mosaic of events of that fateful night. The autopsy results confirmed the initial diagnosis of a heart attack. However, Green could not escape the feeling that there was something more behind this seemingly natural death. There were too many details that didn't add up. The detective went back to the testimony of the neighbors. Most of them described Wilford as a quiet, intelligent man who kept to himself, but was always polite and friendly. Several, however, noted changes in the professor's behavior in recent months. Mrs. Johnson, an elderly neighbor of Wilford's, said that lately she had often seen a young woman, the wife of businessman Daryl Jackson, visit the professor's home. These visits, she said, were becoming more frequent and more prolonged. Green tapped his pencil thoughtfully on the desk. Chanel Jackson. Her reaction to Wilford's death had been far too emotional for a simple neighborhood acquaintance. The detective decided it was time for a more in-depth conversation with the young woman. He also hadn't forgotten the strange expression on Daryl Jackson's face the day the body was discovered. Green made a note to check the businessman's alibi for the night of Wilford's death. The next step was to examine the deceased's financial records. At first glance, everything looked ordinary. The professor's pension, fees for books and lectures. What caught Green's attention, however, was a series of large cash withdrawals over the past month. Where could that money have gone? The detective went back to looking at Wilford's house. He recalled a slightly ajar closet door and drawers pulled out. Could someone have been looking for that money? Or some documents? Green decided to take another thorough look at the professor's house. This time he noticed the bookshelves in the study among the academic papers and fiction. A series of albums on modern art stood out. Some pages were laid in, and pencil notes were visible in the margins. The detective carefully flipped through the albums. His attention was drawn to a few pieces of paper that had fallen out of one of the books. They were sketches, quick but talented sketches of a woman's face. Green immediately recognized Chanel Jackson's features. The find confirmed the detective's suspicions of a closer relationship between Wilford and Chanel. But what was the nature of that relationship? And could they have been the cause of the professor's death? Green decided to check Wilford's computer. The police technical department had already worked on cracking the passwords, but so far to no avail. The detective hoped that the email correspondence would shed light on the last days of the professor's life. At the same time, Green began a more thorough probe into Daryl Jackson. The businessman claimed that he had been at a downtown business meeting the night of Wilford's death. That alibi was corroborated by several witnesses, but the detective decided to dig deeper. Jackson's company's financial records showed that the business had been struggling in recent months. Several major investors had backed out, and the bank had rejected a loan application. Green wondered if this could somehow connect Daryl to Wilford's death. The next step was to re-interview Chanel Jackson. This time, the detective decided to conduct the interview in a more formal setting, at the police station. The young woman looked nervous and distressed as she entered the interview room. Green began the conversation from afar, asking about life in the neighborhood, about relations with neighbors. Gradually, he brought the conversation to Wilford Baker. Chanel visibly tensed when the professor's name was uttered. The detective gently but persistently questioned the nature of their relationship. At first, Chanel tried to get away with general phrases, but under Green's gaze began to confuse in the testimony. Finally, unable to withstand the tension, the young woman burst into tears. Through her tears, she admitted that she and Wilford had indeed had a close relationship. They began a few months ago, when Chanel, feeling lonely and misunderstood in marriage, found in the elderly professor a kindred spirit. Green listened intently, noting every detail. Chanel said that Wilford supported her pursuit of art, which Daryl had always considered a waste of time. The professor became for her not only a lover, but also a mentor who opened the world of creativity and freedom of expression. Recently, however, their relationship had become strained. Wilford insisted that Chanel left her husband and started a new life. He even offered financial assistance so that she could pursue art professionally. That explained the large cash withdrawals from his account, Green reflected. Chanel's story explained a lot, but there were still questions. Why had Wilford died on this particular night? Was the heart attack due to natural causes, or was something else involved? The detective decided to double-check the toxicology results. He requested a second, more thorough examination. The results were surprising. Traces of verapamil, a drug used to treat hypertension and arrhythmia, were found in Wilford's blood. However, the dose was well above the therapeutic dose, which could have led to a sharp drop in heart rate. Green recalled the glass of water on Wilford's bedside table. Could the medication have been dissolved in the water? Or had someone replaced the professor's regular pills with stronger ones? The detective began checking to see who in Wilford's entourage might have had access to such a drug. He examined the neighbor's medical records and discovered that Daryl Jackson was being treated for hypertension and was taking verapamil. This discovery caused Green to reconsider his theory. Perhaps Daryl had found out about his wife's relationship with Wilford and decided to get revenge by using his medication. The detective decided to conduct another thorough search of Wilford's home, focusing on looking for traces of medication or empty packages. He also requested surveillance footage from a nearby pharmacy to see if any of the suspects had recently purchased verapamil. At the same time, the technical department finally hacked into Wilford Green's computer and delved into the professor's email correspondence. Most of the emails concerned his academic activities, but for the past few weeks, the mail had been dominated by letters from an anonymous sender. The content of these emails made the detective tense. It seemed someone was blackmailing Wilford by threatening to reveal his relationship with Chanel. The sender was demanding a large sum of money for his silence. Green reconsidered his theory. Perhaps Wilford's death was not only related to his affair with Chanel, but also to the blackmail. Who could have known about his secret relationship and used that information? The detective returned to the list of neighbors. His attention was drawn to the figure of Luke Wilson, a young computer programmer who lived across the street from Wilford. Wilson had mentioned in his statement that he sometimes helped the professor with computer problems. Could he have accidentally learned of Wilford's correspondence with Chanel? Green decided to check Wilson's financial situation. It turned out that the young man had recently repaid a large loan, although his official income hardly allowed it. Coincidence? Or a trail leading to a clue? The detective felt he was getting closer to a clue. He decided to set up surveillance on the prime suspects, Luke Wilson and Daryl Jackson. He hoped that under the pressure of the investigation, one of them might make a mistake that would lead to the uncovering of the truth. Green also hadn't forgotten about Chanel. Although she had an alibi for the night of Wilford's death, the detective didn't rule out her involvement. Perhaps she knew more than she was telling. The investigation entered a crucial phase. Detective Green was determined to solve all the mysteries behind Wilford Baker's death. He realized that each new fact brought him closer to the truth, but also complicated the crime. Behind the facade of a quiet suburb lay a web of lies, passions, and betrayals that led to a tragic finale. Green knew he still had a lot of work to do. He had to find the connection between the blackmail, the change of medication, and Wilford's relationship with Chanel. Every detail could prove to be a clue in this convoluted case. The detective was ready to go all the way to the end to get justice, no matter how bitter it might turn out to be. He felt that the solution was close at hand, and was determined to uncover all the secrets behind Wilford Baker's death. Detective Patrick Green sat in his office late at night, surrounded by mountains of documents and photographs. The investigation into Wilford Baker's death was coming to an end, and Green felt that the last pieces of the puzzle were about to fall into place. The last few days had been filled with intense work. Green and his team had conducted numerous interviews, analyzed hours of video footage, and studied hundreds of pages of financial documents. Now, looking at the evidence board, the detective began to see the full picture of what had happened. The key was discovering the connection between Luke Wilson and the anonymous emails blackmailing Wilford. Technical experts were able to trace the IP address from which the emails were sent, and it matched Wilson's home address. Further investigation revealed that Wilson had actually installed a remote access program on Wilford's computer when he helped him with technical problems. This allowed the young programmer to monitor the professor's correspondence and learn about his relationship with Chanel. However, Green realized that blackmail alone was not enough for murder. The key to the clue was information about the drugs. The detective discovered that a week before Wilford's death, Daryl Jackson really bought verapamil at a local pharmacy. But the most interesting part was that Luke Wilson had visited the same pharmacy on the same day. Green began to put the pieces of the puzzle together. He hypothesized that Wilson, by blackmailing Wilford, had somehow learned of the professor's heart problems. Perhaps he had overheard the conversation or seen the recipe during one of his visits. The programmer decided to use this information to get rid of Wilford and cover up the evidence of blackmail. But how did Wilson gain access to Daryl's medication? Green recalled that during one of the interrogations, Chanel had mentioned that she sometimes asked Luke to pick up her husband's medications from the pharmacy because he lived closest to her. The detective speculated that Wilson could have substituted Daryl's pills for stronger pills, and then switched Wilford's medication with those enhanced pills. That would explain the elevated dose of verapamil in the professor's bloodstream. Green decided it was time for the final act. He arranged for all the suspects to meet at Wilford's house, ostensibly for additional questions about the case. The next day, Chanel and Daryl Jackson, Luke Wilson, and several other neighbors gathered in Wilford Baker's living room. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone sensed this was no ordinary interrogation. Green began by reviewing the facts of the case, slowly leading those present to his conclusions. He talked about Wilford and Chanel's relationship, Daryl's financial difficulties, the blackmail, and the switching of medications. When the detective mentioned the remote access program installed on Wilford's computer, Luke Wilson visibly tensed. His eyes raced around the room as if looking for an escape route. Green continued, describing how the killer had replaced Wilford's medication with stronger pills, knowing of his heart problems. He explained that the perpetrator used Daryl's medication to ward off suspicion. But the killer didn't take one thing into account, Green said, looking directly at Luke Wilson. The cameras at the pharmacy recorded his purchase on the same day Daryl purchased his medication. Wilson jumped up, trying to rush for the exit, but was stopped by the police officers waiting outside the door. Detective Green read him his rights, while the rest of those present looked on with shock and horror. Luke Wilson, realizing that there was no point in denying it, began to speak. He confessed to blackmail and murder, explaining that initially he just wanted easy money. But when Wilford began threatening to reveal his actions, Wilson panicked and decided to get rid of the professor. Chanel sobbed, realizing her unwitting role in the tragedy. Daryl, pale and shaken, tried to comfort his wife, though he himself was barely on his feet from shock. Green watched the scene with mixed feelings. He had solved the case, but the cost of this disclosure was ruined lives and relationships. It had been 6 months since Luke Wilson's unmasking. Life in a quiet suburb of Atlanta was slowly returning to normal, although the effects of the tragedy were still being felt. Luke Wilson was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Wilford Baker and blackmail. His confession and cooperation with the investigation helped him avoid the death penalty, but his life was irrevocably ruined. Chanel and Daryl Jackson tried to save their marriage. They began seeing a marriage therapist in an attempt to overcome the effects of Chanel's infidelity and the shock of everything that had happened. The process was painful, but both were determined to give their relationship a second chance. Chanel, inspired by Wilford's support, decided to take up painting in earnest. She opened a small gallery where she exhibited her work and paintings by other aspiring artists. It became a way for her to honor Wilford's memory and find new meaning in her life. Daryl, realizing how close he was to losing his wife, reassessed his priorities. He began to devote more time to his family and even began to take an interest in art, trying to understand Chanel's passion. Wilford Baker's house was sold, and the proceeds, according to his will, went to create a fund to support young African-American artists. It became the professor's final gift to the art world he loved so much. Detective Patrick Green was promoted for solving this complex case. However, he was left feeling bitter about how one rash decision could ruin so many lives. The neighbors, initially shocked by what had happened, gradually returned to their normal lives, but now they looked at each other with greater wariness, realizing that behind the perfect facades, dark secrets could lurk. The story of Wilford Baker and the events leading up to his death became the subject of much discussion and even formed the basis of a book written by a local journalist. It served as a reminder of how passion, greed, and lies can lead to tragic consequences. Chanel often visited Wilford's grave, bringing him fresh flowers and telling him about her success in painting. She felt she had found her calling and was grateful to the professor for helping her find herself, even if the cost was so high. Daryl, overcoming his jealousy and pain, supported his wife in her endeavors. He realized that art was Chanel's way of healing, and tried to be there to help her move forward. Life in the suburbs gradually returned to normal, but the memory of what happened left an indelible trace in the souls of all participants in this drama. Each of them learned their lessons from the tragedy and tried to live on, carrying the memory of the man whose death changed their lives forever. Detective Green sometimes drove past the house where Wilford Baker had once lived. He reminisced about the investigation, about the complex puzzle he had to put together. The case had taught him that outward prosperity could hide the darkest of secrets, and that human nature was far more complex than it seemed at first glance. The story of Wilford Baker, Chanel Jackson, and Luke Wilson was a cautionary tale for many. It showed how easily the line between right and wrong can be crossed, how one wrong decision can lead to irreversible consequences. Ultimately, this tragedy became a story about love, betrayal, redemption, and the importance of staying true to oneself and one's principles, despite all the temptations and difficulties of life.